Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming.
It is my pleasure to welcome each of you to the 32nd year of the North Idaho College Public Forum. As program producer and host, it's a great day of celebration for us to continue on the air, and I think I am correct to say that this particular program is the longest running PBS program that is college produced. There are some others that are not college produced. And what a fitting way to start this new year, also on the birthday of the United States Constitution, when we're taping this program on September 17th in the year 2003, on the 216th birthday of the Constitution. So our guest today, and again next week, is certainly deeply involved and has been all of her life in public policy and political issues, and so I'm so pleased that all this is fit together. I welcome to the program a long time friend who's been with us before, and when her husband was a U.S. Senator, was here many times. Our guest is Bethene Church. We have asked Bethene Church to be here today and next week to celebrate her book, and it's just come out, and I want to show it to our audience. It's called A Lifelong Affair, My Passion for People and Politics, and I have a copy here. It is a very exciting book. Our guest, the father was governor, her uncle was governor of Idaho, and her husband was a U.S. Senator for 24 years. I want to quote from the reviews on the book, and everyone knows Cokie Roberts, who was with ABC News and National Public Radio, and she says of the book, "This book is the real deal. It describes politics as it is really played, showing the power of the political wife as partner. It illustrates how campaigns and elections have changed over the last 50 years, and it celebrates the American system, warts and all. It is also a wonderful love story." With that, Bethene, welcome back, and it's so great to see you, and congratulations on this exciting story of your life.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I think it's my first, but probably my only book, and to be here on your celebration of this program is a really special thing, and I really thank you. You know, it's fun to have friends for years and years. Lou Reed's been a friend for always. You've been a friend for so many years, and I have a new friend from last night. And you know, it just makes life so special to like people as much as I do.
Well, certainly that's what your book's about, and we're going to get into it in a moment. It's just such a great treat to have you here as a long time friend. And I welcome on the panel two panelists today. First of all is Mary Lou Reed, who was on this program for many years in those early years, and then she was elected to the Idaho State Senate, where she served distinction for 12 years. And Mary Lou Reed, it's so nice to see you again on the program and for you to be here to interview your very great friend.
Well, thank you, Tony, and congratulations on the longevity of this program. I think it's a marvelous thing. And good luck to you and your crew for a whole nother year.
Thank you.
And wonderful to be here with Bethene. Marvelous to have her in our community, our town, for a couple of days. She's a very special friend. I worked on Frank Church's first campaign. I stuffed envelopes and did lots of little grunt work, and have known Bethene over the years well.
And also to welcome Erna Reinhardt, who's on our panel, and she's the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Erna is a great supporter and assistant on all we do, including the things we do here. Erna, welcome.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll ask Mary Lou Reed to ask the first question of our guest.
Well, thank you, Tony. And Bethene, I have followed your life. I've been a friend, as we say, but I really think we want to have you tell us why you decided to write your life down in a book, and how did you go about doing it?
You know, it's a fascinating thing. Everything happens for a reason, I think. When I came home in '89, I was determined to read all the books on my book table. I was determined to have big parties, or small dinner parties, and they became big dinner parties. I didn't read any of the books, and I meant to write a book, and it took me till 3 years ago.
And when you say come home, when you came home to Boise from Washington, D.C.
Yes, indeed.
Which was also home for a long time.
Yes, but you know, we always had our feet in both places. We were out here in Idaho, all over the state, or, in fact, some lady said to me today, "You were from Wallace, weren't you?" And I said, no, but we were in Wallace a lot. And she said, that may have been where I read about you. But, you know, I call it coming home because I left Washington completely, except for visits. And I bought a new house, sold the one we'd paid for 20 years in Washington. But when I decided to write the book, it was because Dan Williams, who had run for Congress and is younger than my youngest son, and my youngest son got together and they said, you really, really have to write down your stories. It's important. And then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, my sons know a lot about my life, but not everything. And my grandchildren probably know much less. And so I wrote it for all of them, but I also wrote it for our friends and our supporters and my new friends that I've made since I came home. And I did it because I wanted them to know that I think politics is a very, very important profession. I have a passion for it and for people. And so I thought, I just want to tell my story. And with their urging, I talked into a computer. I mean, no, you don't talk to a computer. I talked to a tape recorder.
Right.
And then Dan put it on a computer. I'm so good with things. I had a friend a long time ago who said, I really don't like machines. I haven't liked anything, including the vacuum cleaner. And
well, you make it sound like fun, not like it was easy. And we all know that writing a book is quite a bit of work. So how did you turn it from work into fun? Was it Dan and Chase that made a party of
everything,
it,
but also my friends that would come to have the few small dinners I gave. Most of my dinners were big dinners for Democratic groups or for civic groups or for causes. But my friends who'd come for dinner would say, oh, tell us about that. Or I'd say, have I told you? I have one friend in the neighborhood who said, oh, you have to write a book because I think it should be named, Have I Told You? Because she said, you always tell a different story.
That's
and
right.
On the trip up from Boise to Coeur d'Alene, I kept thinking of things that should be in the book. Don't worry, I'm not going to write a sequel.
Erna Reinhardt.
Bethine, I read your book and finished it a few weeks ago, and it's a wonderful, wonderful read. I would highly recommend it to anybody. And I learned a lot about Idaho, and I learned a lot about your husband. And what you do throughout the book is a chronology. So let's start from the very beginning. Tell us about your childhood, and you were born into the political life. So tell us a little bit about your family and your younger years growing up in Idaho.
Well, I really came from a pioneer city, Mackay, Idaho, in the Lost River Valley, which had pioneers of all kinds. It had sheep herders and cattlemen and miners and gamblers and everything. And my pop would always sit down, and those were before the days of television dinners, sit down around the table and tell us the wonderful stories. So I felt like I had to tell some of those stories. And of the ranch, the Robinson Bar Ranch on the Salmon River, where I spent every single summer, and where I just loved it so much. And I loved the whole Stanley Basin and the Sawtooth area. And then, when I was 4 years, in the fourth grade, really, we went over to Idaho Falls. It was after the Depression. We'd sold everything except the ranch in order to, Pop was a director in a bank, and he thought there were too many people who wouldn't get any money back. So he sold everything he had to help put money back for the people who couldn't ever recoup it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, before any insurance on anything that was in banks. And so after the Depression, we were really sort of broke, and we left Mackay and went to Idaho Falls, where my grandmother lived. And eventually, the Clark family, and that was my pop's family. My grandfather had been the first mayor of Idaho Falls. And at one time in Republican Idaho, there were 3 Clarks on the ticket. And they got out a very scurrilous pamphlet that went all over the state that said, "Clark, Clark, Clark," said the little red hen. And they emphasized little red hen. And it had scurrilous things in it. My cousin was running for the House of Representatives. My uncle was running for governor, and Pop was running for mayor. And my mother was madder than a wet hen. And she said, "Who did this?" And she said, "Do you know?" And Pop said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, let me call him up." She wasn't a very good politician, but she was a very staunch supporter of the family. And she said, "Let me call him up because they should not have said that." And Pop said, "Don't worry about it. It will probably elect all 3 of us." And the miracle of it all, this big smear, and it did elect all 3 of them.
Fabulous.
So that's sort of fun.
Neat.
In introducing the program for the viewers in other states and in Canada that don't have as much the history of Idaho as we do, as we indicated, you were a member of the Clark family, and your uncle was Governor Clark, and your father was Governor Clark, and another cousin was a U.S. representative, and then the distinguished career of your husband, Senator Frank Church, who was elected in 1956 and served through 1980, and was even chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate and ran for president in 1976. So I want to get that back on the table. But going from there, maybe we could pick up with some of the stories in your book concerning after you grew up. Tell us where you went to school, and then we'll talk a little bit about your father being governor.
Well, I grew up really in the mountain country and in Idaho Falls, and I loved it. I marched in the marching band. I played the clarinet poorly, I have to admit, but they kept me because I marched very well. And when my father ran for governor, I was a big supporter. And he won, surprised us all. And so, in the middle of my senior year in high school, I moved from Idaho Falls to Boise, Idaho.
Because he was becoming governor.
Yes, and let me tell you, it's a wonder I wasn't the worst mixed-up mess in the world. I left everybody I knew. I left everything, all my friends. And if I hadn't met Frank and Carl Burke and Stan Burns and all of their friends, and if they hadn't come over to our house every Sunday evening to raid my mother's icebox, to schmooze at the governor, and to talk with me, I would have been miserable. But as it was great fun. I just loved every minute of it. And my mother finally said one day, "Why aren't there any girls that come with the boys?" And I said, "Mom, that would make us dates, and they don't even think I'm a girl." And right from then on, I knew Frank. He wrote me, the first thing he ever wrote me was a fairly political little card. However, it began with "Dearest Bethine" and ended with "Love, Frosty," and it said on the bottom, "Today I'm 17." And since I keep everything, I have that. What I don't have are notes or diaries. And so I decided, since after all I was coming along in years, that I better tell all these stories while I could still remember them. And I started by trying to dredge up some of my father's best stories, and I found I remembered very key ones, but some were gone. And I thought, I have to write this book while I can remember conversations. I can actually see people in my mind when Frank was having a confrontation. And I have to tell people that, you know how you see on television the candidate speaking and his wife standing sweetly by? and then the campaign, or crying because they've lost, and then the campaign is over, and I've always said it this way: she just falls off the platform. You never see her for years until he runs again. Well, that wasn't the case with Frank and with me. I was always with him, and I felt impelled to tell everybody that if you're a part of something, and your husband lets you be a part of something, he was my lover and my best friend. And I just wanted people to know that that made life very special.
Mary Reed.
Well, and Bethine, going along with your life, then you and Frank eventually decided that you really were going to be lovers and get married, and then you went to across the country.
We certainly did, but the getting there was a little arduous because I got mad at him for a letter he wrote from Indian Burma in China. He was in the intelligence part of the army in China and was there quite a little bit after the war. So he wrote me this letter telling me he had all these aspirations and he didn't want to hold up my life and he didn't want me to wait for him and all of this junk. And so I just got very interested in a friend that I'd known at Ann Arbor, and I got briefly engaged. Then I kept thinking, this isn't a very good idea. And Stan Burns, Frank's good friend, said to Frank, who had come back from the war and gone back to Stanford to finish his undergraduate school, said, Frank, who do you want to marry? And he said, Bethine, but she's engaged. He said, well, you better call her up and tell her. So that happened. And we married, and we went back to Stanford for him to complete his law school. And while he was doing it, he had a cancer. And the doctor said he was going to die. And I said, oh, no, you're not. It took me all this long to get you, and you can't die now.
That's a powerful will.
Well, he was 24 years old, and he got well. We went back. He practiced law for only 5 years. And then one day he came into the house and he said, you know, I really think I'd like to run for the Senate.
Was this out of the blue?
Out of the blue. Excuse me. This traveling and talking is getting to me. However, he said, you know, if Glenn Taylor runs and there's anyone else in the race, I'll lose it. Because Taylor had always gotten a definite number of votes.
And he had been a U.S. Senator.
And he had been a U.S. Senator, although he'd lost several primaries. And then there were two other men, one from North Idaho, one from South Idaho, who'd run before. So my pop said, you can't possibly win, but it's a great idea to do it. You're a young lawyer. You'll get your name known. Pop was a big supporter of Frank's. So we launched. We got into it. It was like having a baby. For 9 months, we ran to get Frank known. The way we were able to do it was we had bought a house, and we had $6,000 in it that was ours. We spent our $6,000, and the way we were able to do that was we just moved our son and everything we had, and Frank and myself, into my pop and mom's in Boise. And they took care of Forrest, and I drove the car and dispensed vitamins and reminded him that the troops have to eat a lot or they don't last. That's why we have supply corps with the troops. And off we went. And everywhere we went, he wasn't known. He had to say, I'm Frank Church. I'm running for the United States Senate. He was 32 years old and looked probably 24. And as handsome as he was, he looked too young to people. And they'd say that. And he'd say, well, if I'm too young, I can grow out of it. But if you need representation, I can give it to you. We just had a great time. It was wonderful. And when we finally won, which was very remarkable, we won by about 149,000, 100 votes, 149 votes, not thousands.
Was that the primary or the general?
Primary.
That was beating Glenn Taylor.
Yeah, but then we wiped the election. Herman Welker was known by a label, Welker, the fighting senator. And we tried to get him to debate, like all unknowns try to get the sitting senator to debate. And he finally figured out how to debate us. He chose a time when he knew we were at least 50 miles from where we should be to debate. We had another engagement because we'd put out our whole schedule in order to get people to come out and see Frank. And he thought we couldn't be there. So he gave us a challenge to debate in Burley, Idaho. And we were in Buell. And they didn't recognize how determined our supporters or Frank was. Because this friend in Buell said, "Don't worry about it. I can get a plane and get you there." He said, "Of course, it's going to be dusk and there are no lights because we have to go off just a regular field. But we'll put the cars on either side of it and turn on the lights, and we'll be able to do it." But the interesting part of that, and that was one of my very first experiences with bad flying, it was a crop duster. And so when we got to Burley, I was so cold. If anyone's ever ridden in a crop duster, you know there's a lot of space there.
You're out in it.
Oh, and was I cold. And Frank always said, "Will you put a chair on the stage? Bethine will sit with me." And I said, "Frank, I can't. I'm too cold. I'm shaking. They'll think I'm scared." And Frank, like he always said, "Oh, come on, Bethine, just wrap your legs around the chair's leg." So I did. And off we went. But when we got there, I looked around. There was Henry Dvorak, the other U.S. Senator, and all of these. Yes, you have to. That's one thing my editor did for me. She would write me and say, "Who was that?" And then I take it for granted everybody knows, you know. I forget that nobody even knows about Vietnam, all of these things that happened. But there we were. And there was Dvorak, lots of other Republicans, a huge stacked crowd of people, and no Herman Welker. So Frank said, "Where's the senator?" And they said, "Oh, he's already given his presentation." And Frank said, "He did?" And they said, "Well, he sent a phonograph record." Well, Frank was a great debater. He'd won the Medal Joff at Stanford University. He had debated in Hawaii on the case against Hawaiian statehood that everybody was for, so he could debate on all sides of things. And I could just see this gleam in his eyes. He suddenly was not a candidate. He was a debater, and he just took this on, and he said, well, he had done all these other things, but he had never, ever debated a phonograph record before. And everybody out there in the audience sort of chuckled. And then they had stacked it with questions like, why did you take any money from the Committee for a Livable World, which we know is a communist dupe? Why money from the Committee for an Effective Congress? And Frank aced that too. He said, well, isn't that funny? I thought that what people wanted was a livable world and an effective Congress. And he said, I'm really glad to be here tonight. It was all broadcast over the air, not in television, but in radio in the area. And we carried Burley, miracle of all time. And you know, that whole campaign cost us about $59,000.
Wow. I was going to ask you what your greatest memory was, but
that was it.
Yeah, exactly.
Of that campaign, anyway.
So so Frank won the election. Tell us then what kind of preparation goes into what you need to do before you make the big move to Washington, D.C.? Did you have a family at that point in time? Did you have children?
Well, I had a 7-year-old who had already been with my parents on and off this entire election, but who was very well adjusted. My parents were fabulous. They were the best second parents anybody could have, and the best first parents I could have had, and Frank too. And so it was just, I think, just after Thanksgiving and just after the election, and Frank said, we're going to have some place to live. And he said, Bethine, you're going to have to fly to Washington and get us someplace to live. I'd just been through all of this. I thought, why? And he said, well, I promised the people in Silver Valley. I hadn't had time to go down into the Lucky Friday mine, and I've got to do it. I promised them. So he went north and went down in the mine, and I got on a plane on a very foggy week. It took me 2 days to get out. We got to somewhere in the Midwest, and everything was socked in, and we had to take a bus part of the way. And I can remember we were all so irritated and so tired that we put a suitcase across a couple of seats and played bridge. And I hadn't played bridge since our old bridge clubs in Idaho Falls. Well, I didn't lose my shirt. I survived the night, and I finally got to Washington and looked for a house. And guess what happened? I looked, and Scotty Peak and Bobby Baker, who were Lyndon Johnson's main people, met me with a big limousine.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, but we will continue.
You can't believe it.
It's time so fast, but you're back next week. So the good news is we shall continue next week on the program. And ladies and gentlemen, at that time, Bethine Church will be back to finish that story and tell a lot of other wonderful stories about her book. We're just delighted to have her here with us. And this is how the book reads, so we hope that you will get the book, and we'll tell you more next week about it. It's the Francis Press, and it came out this month in September 2003. Hope you'll be with us again next week at the same time when we shall continue interviewing Bethine Church. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station. Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am most pleased to welcome you back from last week. Last week we started the 32nd year of this Public Forum. We're so delighted to have been on the air so long. And our guest last week was Bethine Church, and we're so pleased to have her back again this week. And we invite her to the program because of a book that's just been published. In fact, it says in the advertising material that as of September 17, 2003, by the Francis Press, a book called A Lifelong Affair, My Passion for People and Politics. And here is the cover of how the book looks. And what I find interesting about that date of publication, that is the birthday of the United States Constitution, his 216th birthday. In this book, Bethine Church talks about her life. It's been a fascinating political life. Her father was Governor Clark of Idaho. She had an uncle, also Clark, that was governor, a cousin who was a U.S. representative, and her husband, Frank Church, was a United States Senator elected in 1956 and served through 1980. in Idaho. And at the time, I believe the youngest person ever elected to the U.S. Senate at age 31 or 32. And this is a wonderful book about all those years. And what's so interesting about the book and our guest is that she is one of the very few spouses that just was with her husband at almost all times in hearings in the Senate and traveling around the world. She met leaders from all over the world. And it's often been said that during Senator Church's tenure as senator, we had 3 senators from Idaho. And with that introduction, Bethene, welcome back to the program. It's great to see you again, and you've been a friend for 34 years, and it's always great to have you in Coeur d'Alene.
I tell you, it's great to be back with you, and I think to be on your first program of the year talking about my first and probably only book is a great delight. And, you know, we sort of ended last week with me trying to talk a little about Lyndon Johnson, but when you realize that I was there when he was majority leader, I was there when he was president, I was there when John Kennedy was president, and I always have had a real passion for the Camelot years. You know, all of those things matter to me.
You bet. And then you've just met almost all the great leaders in the democratic countries of the world, and even some countries that were not democratic. You also met leaders, and so you have really had an incredible life. And again, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to welcome to our panel Mary Lou Reed, who's a former state senator. She was on this program for many years and then was elected to the state senate of Idaho, where she served for 12 years with great distinction. And Mary Lou, it's great to have you back to interview your friend. And
fun to be here. Fun to be here.
And very pleased to have Erna Reinhardt, who is the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And with that, Mary Lou Reed will start the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. And Bethene, let's start off this program talking about Lyndon Johnson. What a complex, a difficult, and amazing and awful. Really, you could use any adjective to describe him. And in this marvelous book that Robert Caro just wrote, Master of the Senate, he outlines Johnson's masterful running of the Senate. But one of the chapters is really devoted to Frank Church. And I think he got a lot of the information from interviewing you. And he gives Frank Church a great deal of credit for the passage of the first Civil Rights Bill. Would you talk a little bit about that and about Lyndon Johnson and how he was able to make wonderful things happen, sometimes in very disturbing ways?
Well, Lyndon was an arm twister. I will always remember Frank saying to me, I have to be really careful when Lyndon charges down the aisle toward me, because he's a great for being so tall, for tipping his head over, and us having what Frank called a nostril-to-nostril conversation.
Right into his speech.
Yeah, right, as I say. I can almost see it again. And he did this with everybody in the Senate, both sides of the aisle. Anything he wanted, he worked on madly. And Caro himself understood how well he'd done getting through that Civil Rights Bill. He gave Frank a lot of credit, which I loved, and he interviewed me a lot, and I am quoted in that book. And I've been interviewed for many books on many different things, but it's the first time I've ever been extensively quoted, and I thought that was so nice. And when I asked him if he'd read this book and do a blurb, he said, well, he wasn't doing it this year. You know, he just won the Pulitzer, and he said, I'm really not doing that sort of thing right now, but for you I will. And he did.
Would you want to say a little something about what Frank did for the Civil Rights Bill? It's a good story.
Well, I always talk too much, so I'm glad you sort of prompt me along. But there was a jury trial amendment up that was going to really ruin the whole bill, because the liberals were entirely, in the Senate, were entirely against it. All those who worked for civil rights were against it. And Frank thought that you had to have trial by jury. You don't give a right by taking a right. So he worked out with O'Mahony of Wyoming and with Clint Anderson and with several other people. He worked on an addendum to the Civil Rights Bill and to the jury trial amendment that would make federal juries in federal cases, that would make them non-segregated. Well, the fact that the Southerners wanted the jury trial, and yet the fact that the Northerners were able to vote for this addendum made the Civil Rights Bill go through.
And it went through.
And it went through. And Rollie Evans, who was a columnist at the time, I met him at the poolside party right after it. And he said to me, how this happened, how Lyndon did the addendum and all of this. I said, no, you're wrong. I was sitting in Frank's office when he worked it out with O'Mahony and all of the other senators for the West that worked on it. And I contemplated, since I have a short fuse occasionally, pushing him in the pool. But I didn't. But having told him he was wrong, Frank said, oh, that's great. You have probably got his enmity for all time. And I sure did. But Frank forgave me.
Erna Reinhardt.
Let's move on to the Vietnam War. And I know that from reading your book, your husband, Senator Church, and you had differing opinions about the Vietnam War. And it sounds as though you guys had very many lengthy discussions in the evenings, and you were very involved in his life. You spent many hours in the Senate gallery. But tell us a little bit about what that was like to be in Washington, D.C. during that very tumultuous time, and how you two had differences of opinion and how you kind of came together on that issue.
Well, you know, it's a strange thing. It sort of goes back to Lyndon. I never could be mad at him when I was standing by him or talking to him. He was always wonderful to me. And yet I knew how much pressure he used on so many things. And eventually Frank said that he thought that the Great Society was Lyndon's very special thing, and he made it not happen eventually because of the money that went into Vietnam. And that the Vietnam War became Lyndon's Alamo. But I loved Lady Bird so much, and I worked with her on every committee that came up. I made calls for her when Head Start started, which I loved. I did everything she wanted me to do. And when I found Frank in such opposition to her husband on this, I thought, like my father thought, probably the president knows best. Well, Frank didn't just say, oh, come on. He said, I really have to convince you. You come to any discussion of this, you've been there from the Gulf of Tonkin. We were at dinner the night they informed us that we'd been hit, which was garbage. And Frank just said, look, let's talk about it. We talked about it for 3 solid months. And one night he came home for dinner and he said, I can tell by the look on your face we're not going to have Vietnam for dinner. And I said, no, you finally convinced me. I think you're absolutely right. And I went back to the fact that I'd flown in that helicopter into the first fortified village in Vietnam that was for the Montagnards. And that was before Diem fell and before we were fully involved, when we just had Green Berets and a few Army people there. And I remembered that jungle, and I thought, they can't clear it. We can't do what they say we could do. And Frank said we couldn't. And he never blamed Kennedy for the assassination of Diem, because he came through town one time coming back from Laos. I had gotten my first bug and hadn't gone to Laos. He said I didn't miss anything. It was Lower Svobovia, but in dust. But he came back to town, to Saigon, and they had cordoned off the streets 7 blocks wide to get Diem through town. They just happened to go through on that same thing. So he knew it wasn't. He said, that is not a popular leader when you have to do that. Mm-hmm. And he finally convinced me. And once he convinced me, he was kind enough to say, now that you've taken me on every argument, I am ready to take on everyone else.
Great.
Bethany, it's so difficult to know what to ask about Senator Church's career, Frank Church's career, because he was a really universal senator, a Renaissance approach. He was an expert in so many areas, and he was certainly highly qualified to become president. He ran in 1976, and I believe I'm correct, he got into the race late, but I believe out of the 5 primaries, he won 4 and almost won the other one. He really connected with people. But we've talked about civil rights, which he was a leader in that area. He certainly in dealing with, reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt with preserving, like Teddy Roosevelt National Parks, and he in the wilderness area. Certainly was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and was expert in that area. But I want to talk about something we haven't talked about today at all, and that is, I recall during those remarkable years of his being in office, he was so interested in senior citizens and had hearings in Idaho on senior citizens and chaired the subcommittee. Tell us about his commitment to senior citizens programs.
Well, in a way, it began very hilariously. No, it didn't begin hilariously. His service began to. But when we were in Idaho, he was the first person to set up what he called courthouse tours, asking people to come. Well, at that time, mostly senior citizens came because they were terrified not of getting old, but of being sick if they got old. Because there was a lien law then, the lien law, and they could take their house, they could take everything. There wasn't any Medicare. And so he got involved in Medicare legislation, right away after he had these tours. But he became the chairman of the Select Committee on Aging eventually. But when he first went on the committee, he said to Verda Barnes, I'm on so many committees. He was on the Interior, and he was Foreign Relations, and he was on this and that, and he was running to all these meetings. And he said, why, as a youngest senator, should I be on that committee? And Verda Barnes, who was one of the first women AAs in the whole Senate, and she was Frank's, was a marvelous Idahoan and a terrific woman, but also one of the best politicians I ever knew. And she said to Frank, don't worry, Senator, you'll get old soon enough, and you need to know what your constituents who are old in Idaho face. And he did, and he was involved from that day on.
In that process, really.
Well, Bethany, the time slips away so fast. I don't want to end this time without your talking about the role of money in politics. You talked last week about how in 1956 the Frank Church campaign spent about $59,000. I think you then had successful campaigns in 62, 1968, 1974. By the time he ran in 1980, his campaign was costing millions. What has happened over these years, and what is your personal feeling about your concern about the fact that there is so much money?
I'm never good on money, but believe it or not, even in that last 80 campaign, it wasn't expensive like it is now. Anything from $1.5 to $2 million seemed like a mammoth amount of money here in the state of Idaho. Frank hated it. He would have really had a hard time running again because he hated the way you had to raise money. He liked the issues. He liked what he was doing. He liked his work. And it takes away from your work to spend your time on the telephone raising dollars.
Right.
And I can just remember so well his saying, maybe what they should do is just look at how many voters come out in the state and say you can only spend $2 or $3 per voter. And that would make it so low. But no campaign financing plan, not even the Feingold McCain bill, has really solved the problem. Everybody always finds a way around.
Right. And it gets more and more expensive every single
And we have now millionaires in the Senate. A person like Frank that ran for 9 months to get known ran against an incumbent, could hardly ever win unless he had every break of luck in the world. So money has skewed it. The main reason I hate the way money's skewed it is because young people now no longer believe in the system. They don't believe that their vote counts. They don't believe that their word counts, what they have to say counts. And this system was set up to make the people the government. And they forget that they are the government. Mm-hmm. And I could get on a soapbox about it. I think I never speak to young people, but what I say, you're what's going to make the future. You're what can make the Constitution and the Bill of Rights work. And if you are not involved, we just don't have a democratic political system. And as Frank said over and over, it is the very best system on earth. And if I could go a little further, I also say, it's not the might of our arms, which Frank always used to say. It's not the might of our arms, it's the might of our ideas and our ideals, what our founding fathers set us up with, that lights candles all over the world. And he would be appalled to see us blow them out as we blow off our friends. It's just tragic.
Bethine, looking back over your husband's political career, is there one or two things that you would say are highlights for you on what he has left for the citizens of Idaho? What one or two things really stand out in your mind that were his legacy to the people of Idaho?
Well, first of all, when I came back, even his political enemies said the one thing that they admired about him was his integrity. You know, when Frank took a stand, he didn't just take it, and he didn't hold his finger in the wind and look at the polls. He went out and told everybody, time after time, news release after news release, speech after speech, why he was doing it. That is important to me right to this day. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's so important to me is that he left a legacy of the Frank Church, the River No Return Wilderness, the Gospel Hump Wilderness, the Wilderness Bill, the first Wilderness Bill, he floor managed because Clint Anderson had a gallbladder attack. And we were up for re-election, and Frank said, well, this is a fine kettle of fish that we're in. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, Clint asked me, I'll floor manage it. Frank was always that way. He knew it wasn't good politics for here, but he knew it was important. Mm-hmm. And it has not only been important to Idaho, it's been important to our children, our grandchildren. It's important to the whole United States and the world. People come from all over to visit the Sawtooth, to go down the River of No Return, to go north to Hell's Canyon. I mean, it's magical. Mm-hmm. We just have a great state.
Mary Lou Reed will appreciate this so much. Scott Reed gave one of the great eulogies at Central Church's service, and in that he said that was the great, their statues to people and so forth, but to Frank Church it was those great preservations for future generation was the monument that he'll be remembered for. But I have to have you to tell a story about how powerful you could be. And you know where I'm headed. It's on the other side of this coin, and that has to do with a dam that was built in Idaho and was named after a U.S. senator. But I don't believe that dam would be there without you. Would you share that story?
Well, I was asked several times if that story had ever been told before, and I said no. I was always a bit embarrassed about it, but I was lucky. In Washington, I worked with all sorts of really marvelous women. One was Lindy Boggs, who became a House member in her own right and who became an ambassador to the Vatican. I worked with Carrie Davis, and I was out here campaigning like mad in our first re-election campaign. I got a call from Frank, will you do something for me? And I said, what do you think I'm doing? I'm campaigning my heart out. And he said, no, I need something special. And he told me this in a phone booth. He said, you call Carrie Davis because I can't get the bill not even to a hearing or out of Judge Davis, who is House Member Davis from Tennessee's committee.
He'd already passed the Senate. The bill.
Oh, yeah. Frank had gotten through the Senate like that. But he just couldn't even get it to the floor of the House. And he said, you ask Carrie if she can do anything. And I said, oh, I really hated to. But I called Carrie, and I told her we had a dam we had to have. And according to all of our supporters in the North, you know, they needed jobs, they needed everything. And Carrie said, why, honey, you should have asked me right away. There's no problem at all. The next week, Judge Davis not only reported it out of his committee, he supported it, and it passed like that. And I never go by the dam, but I'm glad it's named for Dworshak, not for me or for Frank.
And he was, Dworshak was a senator from Idaho, or had been, and it's named after him. One other, and I would have to add a footnote that Ms. Davis was also influential with her husband. So it's a good example where...
Oh, let me tell you, the women I knew and worked with out there, whether it was Lindy Boggs with Hale, you know, they had velvet gloves, but boy, were they strong women. And they were different in those days. When I went to the Senate Wives Red Cross, later on women said, oh, well, that folding bandages, that's silly, they can do it, you know, by machine. That's not what I got out of it. I got to know people like Mrs. Symington, Evie Symington, like Mrs. La Follette, like Abigail McCarthy. I mean, people I got to love, and I'd hear their stories. And it teaches you how to be a good Senate wife. I mean, it was just wonderful.
Mary Reed.
Well, no question that what Senator Frank Church was a visionary. We are all grateful for the wilderness. But there was another policy that he talked about a lot. He really didn't believe that we as a country should be intervening into the affairs of other countries. And this non-intervention he applied to Lebanon, etc. And it's a policy that I think probably you feel applies today. What would Frank Church be saying about our policies today and being in Afghanistan and Iraq?
I think he would really worry. He'd worry on two fronts. One, our freedom. We can't give it up, our freedom, to be secure. It's important to be secure. But as a free country, you just don't give up your personal freedoms to be secure. Two, you really need the rest of the world, our traditional friends, some of the people we could make friends of. And three, during the whole communist Russian era, we backed so many bad governments, so many dictators, so many people. And anytime we thought someone, for example, we thought Iraq was anti-communist, and we backed them against Iran. You know, we helped cause some of our own problems. And we have carried this to the point where I just don't think you could run foreign policy that way. I think you have to have friends. I think the world has to know that you believe in your life as it is. And when Frank looked into the CIA, he said, you can't, just because you think somebody's a Marxist or a communist, you can't go in and try to eliminate him, like we did with Allende in Chile under Nixon. All the different things that we have done. We tried to kill Castro. You know, I've often thought that if we were sensible about Castro, we have probably made him last a lot longer than he would have lasted. But we were always taking the mafia to go and get rid of him, and they weren't very capable. They tried to put poison in his wetsuit. They tried to blow up his cigar. I mean, give me a break. Anyway, I think of lots of the things Frank said. We never do a symposium at Boise State for the Church Institute. We never do a symposium without some of Frank's words of caution about how you pick your friends, how you pick your enemies, and how important it is to have judgment.
We're just right now out of time, but one final point is that Senator Church told you that the communist system of the Soviet Union was a total failure, and it was a corrupt system, but it would collapse from within itself.
In 1965, Frank, who was always by the opposition being called pink, or red, even worse, said, oh, the Russian system is so flawed. They're going to fall of their own weight. And the night after he was dead, and I was sitting in my living room looking at TV, and all of these giants of Washington talking about how surprised they were that the wall had fallen, I just was amazed, and I thought, Frank wouldn't be surprised.
On that note, we have to bring the program to a conclusion. Bethany Church, on behalf of our panel and our staff, we thank you for being with us this 2 weeks. It's been a delight talking to you about your new book. Congratulations on it, and it's gotten very good reviews, and it's available through the Francis Press for people who would like to get it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time. We will move to another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.